When you hear the word bikini, your brain instantly conjures something very specific: sun, sea, skin, vacations, that hot feeling of summer. But here's a chilling truth. Before bikini became a swimsuit, it was the name of an island. And that island was never hot in the seductive sense. It was hot in another way. So hot that one morning the sky flared like a second sun, coral turned to dust, the sea was torn open, and an entire community was pushed out of its homeland for an experiment they never asked for. If you've ever thought the name bikini symbolized freedom, boldness, modern pop culture, the real story behind it is one of the saddest chapters of the 20th century, the story of Bikini Atoll, a tropical paradise turned into a nuclear laboratory, and a people forced to pack their memories as luggage. Bikini Atoll lies in the Marshall Islands, in the vast middle of the Pacific Ocean. An atoll is a ring-shaped chain of islands enclosing a large lagoon, water clear as glass, vivid coral, fish everywhere. From above, Bikini looks exactly like a postcard. It has everything a travel dream would want: blue sea, white sand, a quiet horizon. And yet, in the eyes of the great powers after World War II, that very remoteness and few people made it a perfect choice for something no one wants to see: testing weapons of mass destruction. After World War II, the world stepped into a new era. People had just witnessed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, terrified, yet haunted by the idea that this power could decide the global order. The United States wanted to understand what an atomic bomb would do to warships, bases, military structures. But to understand, they needed a place to detonate, and they needed that place far enough away that if anything went wrong, it wouldn't fall straight on their own citizens, and it wouldn't ignite domestic politics. The Pacific was enormous, the coral islands were tiny, and on a military map those little dots looked empty. The problem is, they were not empty at all. On those dots were homes, graves, ancestral stories, language, seasonal fishing routines, and entire way of life that outsiders might call simple, but that was, in reality, a complete cultural ecosystem. In 1946, the Americans came to Bikini and asked the people to leave temporarily. Temporarily, they said, for the good of mankind, a sentence so grand that if you are a small community in the middle of the ocean, you almost have no way to argue back on equal terms. At the time, the Bikini population was a little over 100 people, living in a traditional island rhythm tied to the lagoon and the pathways across the reef. They had a leader, they had a community, and most importantly, they had a homeland. That temporary departure began with meetings you can imagine, different languages, different power, and a choice that was hardly a choice. The people agreed to leave, bringing what they could, even dismantling things like their church and community house, the things they believed were the soul of the village. And then they boarded a ship and left the coral ring that had fed them since birth. Their first destination was Rongerik Atoll. On paper, it was an atoll similar to Bikini. In reality, it wasn't. The lagoon held fewer fish. The soil was poorer. Fresh water was more uncertain. A community adapted to a very specific ecosystem was now thrown into a place that felt like a flawed copy. The food supplies provided would last only a few weeks. When they ran out, people had to fend for themselves, but the island did not give them enough to live. Not long after, hunger began to appear. This is the signature tragedy of relocation. On a map, you move a community a few dozen or a few hundred kilometers. In real life, you destroy the entire system that made that community viable. Eventually, they had to leave Rongerik to avoid starvation. They were taken to Kwajalein Atoll, where there was a military base. Try to imagine an island community used to open space, sea, and wind suddenly living in tents near a runway, beside military activity like refugees on what should have been their own territory. After that, they were moved again, this time to Kili Island, a small island without a protective lagoon. For the Bikini people, the lagoon was not just scenery. It was the cradle of fishing, of canoes, of moving between small islets. Without a lagoon, they lost their way of life. They could still survive, but their culture was bent out of shape. And that is the cruelest part. You don't have to kill a community to make it disappear. Sometimes you only have to put it in the wrong place. Meanwhile, Bikini Atoll became the stage for a program with a name that sounded like a strategy game, Operation Crossroads. In the summer of 1946, 2 bombs were detonated at Bikini 1 in the air, 1 underwater. The target was a large fleet anchored inside the lagoon to see how bombs would tear steel apart, blast decks, spread radiation. The images were later filmed and photographed, circulated as icons of the atomic age. There is something icy in the way humans can watch a colossal column of water rise and call it science, while forgetting that this place used to be someone's home. And that was only the opening act. From 1946 to 1958, Bikini endured dozens of nuclear detonations. The explosions did not merely change the island's surfaces. They warped the human imagination of power itself. The peak came in 1954 with the thermonuclear test Castle Bravo. This was no longer an atomic bomb like Hiroshima. This was a hydrogen bomb measured in megatons. Its power was so immense that the initial predictions were catastrophically wrong. When it went off, the sky blazed, a mushroom cloud climbed into the upper atmosphere, and radioactive dust from pulverized coral rode the wind like an invisible storm. In some places, the fallout fell like snow. Children saw the white snow and played in it. Adults continued working outside because who would think snow could kill people in the tropics? Only after a few dozen hours did evacuations begin for communities in the affected areas. But radiation doesn't wait. It enters skin, water, food, bodies, and it stays far longer than a human lifetime. Stories of radiation burns, illness, cancer, and a fear passed down through generations did not remain contained within Bikini. They spread across other atolls in the Marshall Islands. The bitter irony is that the Bikini people were moved away before the tests began, so they were not the group that directly ate the fresh layer of fallout at ground zero. But they were still trapped inside an endless system of consequences. Their homeland was contaminated. They lived in exile. They heard reports of explosions happening on their island, and they faced a brutally simple question. If temporary meant a few months, how long would be long enough to go home? Years later, as the frenzy of nuclear testing cooled, surveys began. Scientists measured radiation in soil, in coconut trees, in breadfruit, in coconut crabs, in groundwater. Some radioactive elements clung so stubbornly that they became part of the food chain. The most dangerous thing is not always what you can see. You can stand on a beach that looks like paradise, feel warm sun and a gentle breeze, and never realize the greatest risk is inside a piece of fruit grown from that soil. In 1968, there was an announcement that Bikini could be inhabited again. For the Bikini people, it sounded like news that a loved one in a long coma had finally opened their eyes. Hope returned. Some people went back and tried to rebuild. But then the hard reality arrived. Even if the landscape looked normal, radiation in food was still a problem. By the late 1970s, many had to leave again because exposure levels rose, especially through local foods. Once more, returning turned into leaving, and the pain doubled. The first departure was forced. The second departure happened because their homeland itself had become unsafe to live in. So what is Bikini today? On the map, it is still a stunning ring of coral. In practice, it has almost no permanent residents like it once did. It has been recognized as World Heritage because it carries a unique historical meaning, a visible symbol of the nuclear era, a place where you can still see traces of detonations and the marks of a strategic decision that traded away the peace of a community. And there is another paradox. Beneath the surface of Bikini's lagoon lie many shipwrecks from the testing era. They have become a famous destination for professional divers, a kind of underwater museum of war and nuclear history. You can swim through enormous steel frames, watch coral cling to a ship's skin, and feel the sea as both beautiful and unsettling because you are literally touring the ruins of an experiment. Now return to the Bikini most of us know, the two-piece swimsuit. It appeared almost at the same time as the first detonations at Bikini. A French designer named the new swimsuit bikini as a shock tactic, implying it would explode like a bomb, create a cultural blast. And it did, but few people stopped to ask, where was the real shock happening, and who was forced to carry the consequences of that explosion in the literal sense? This is the moment when pop culture often does its most dangerous thing, turning pain into a symbol, turning a place name into a fashion word. When you say bikini, you talk about bodies, freedom, liberation. But that name is tied to a displaced community, to an island turned into a laboratory. And what's frightening is how those two stories can exist side by side without touching in most of our minds. We can live our whole lives wearing bikinis, watching films, hearing music, seeing ads, without ever knowing there was another bikini that history pushed into silence. So why does this matter beyond being a dark piece of trivia? Because bikini is a mirror of how power works in the 20th century and even now. The farther a place is from the center, the easier it is to treat it as empty space for experiments to place risk on someone else's head. The smaller a community, the harder its voice is to reach the big meeting rooms. And the more visually beautiful a tragedy is, the easier it becomes packaged as a spectacle, as documentary footage, as an iconic image while real people live with consequences that have no special effects at all. Bikini also reveals an uncomfortable truth about time. The explosion lasts a few seconds. But radiation, displacement, cultural loss, illness, legal battles, and the feeling of betrayal can last for decades. When people say testing, they often imagine a phase of history then it ends. For the bikini people, it became a condition of life. It became the task of explaining to their children why their grandparents' homeland still exists but cannot be safely lived in, why the homeland's name appears on swimsuit billboards, why the world remembers bikini in a way that has nothing to do with their daily life. If you have ever watched old nuclear test footage, you might have found it beautiful in a disturbing way. The perfect mushroom cloud, the sea rising like a wall, the light like mythology. But that beauty is the beauty of destruction. Bikini the island that is not hot or alluring in the way its name suggests is a reminder that some things sound seductive in language and culture, while underneath lies a story of human beings pushed to the margins. It reminds us that behind the modern symbols of explosion, there may be communities forced to pay so we can have a new word for summer. And if there is one conclusion worth keeping, it is not vague guilt, but clear-eyed awareness. Awareness that when a place name suddenly becomes a brand, a joke, a cartoon setting, we should ask, where did that name come from? Awareness that history is not only in books, it is in the words we use every day. And maybe the next time you hear the word bikini, you won't think only of the beach. You will think of a coral ring in the middle of the Pacific, where a small community believed a temporary promising and then had to learn to live with a truth longer than a lifetime.